This hairpin, exquisitely carved from pure jade, could be a gift from the emperor, a symbol of immense favor that could elevate a woman to unimaginable power. But it could also be the weapon a rival uses to frame you for a crime you didn't commit. In the Imperial Court, the line between luxury and a death sentence was as thin as a silk thread. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was a gilded cage, and for the thousands of women known as concubines, survival was a game played in the shadows. In this video, we explore what concubinage was really like in the Imperial Courts, the gilded cage. For over 500 years, the Forbidden City in Beijing was the heart of the Chinese Empire, a sprawling complex of palaces and gardens. But deep within its crimson walls lay the inner court, a world almost entirely sealed off from the outside, a world inhabited by women. Popular culture often paints a romantic picture of this life, women in silks, composing poetry, and living in opulent splendor. But the reality was a paradox. Yes, the life of an imperial concubine was one of incredible luxury, but it was also a life of suffocating restriction, profound loneliness, and constant, terrifying pressure. These women were chosen to serve the emperor, with the main goal of bearing him heirs to continue the dynasty. But in doing so, they gave up everything: their families, their freedom, and often their very identities. They entered a world where their value was tied to a single man's attention, and their survival depended on navigating a treacherous social landscape. So what was life really like for the emperor's women? The selection before a woman could enter the gilded cage, she first had to be chosen. This selection process, known as Xiu Nu or elegant female selection, was a bureaucratic and deeply invasive affair that varied between dynasties but was always grueling. During the Ming dynasty, for instance, the process was incredibly far-reaching. While not every single young woman in the entire empire was drafted, the selection was vast, and for many common households, it was a requirement. Eunuchs, the castrated male servants of the palace, were dispatched across the nation to find suitable candidates. Imagine being a young girl, maybe only 13 or 14 years old, taken from your family to be judged. During the Ming Emperor Tianqi's selection in 1621, 5,000 girls were initially brought to the palace. In the first round, 1,000 were immediately dismissed for being too tall, too short, too fat, or too thin. The next day, another 2,000 were sent home after palace experts examined their voices, speech, and posture. This was followed by an inspection of their hands, feet, and the grace of their movement, which eliminated another 1,000. The remaining candidates then faced a month-long trial period inside the palace itself. They were tested on their temperament, intelligence, and character. They were even judged on their sleeping habits, sometimes being made to sleep near the emperor's mother to check for snoring or unpleasant body odors. During the later Qing dynasty, the process was a bit different, limited mainly to girls from the elite Manchu Eight Banners families. Here, family background and political connections mattered most, but for the girl herself, the outcome was the same. If chosen, she would enter the Forbidden City and would likely never see her family again. She left her old life behind to begin a surreal existence, just one face in a crowd, all subordinate to a single man. The hierarchy and the rules. Once inside the Forbidden City, a concubine's life was governed by a rigid and unforgiving hierarchy. This wasn't a sisterhood, it was a pyramid of power where every woman knew her exact place. At the very top sat the Empress, the Emperor's one official wife, always from a high-ranking family and holding supreme authority over the harem. Below her, the ranks cascaded downwards. The Qing dynasty, for example, had a relatively clear 8-tiered system. Directly beneath the Empress was the Imperial Noble Consort, followed by 2 Noble Consorts, 4 Consorts, and 6 Imperial Concubines. These higher-ranking women were granted their own private living quarters, often with dozens of personal maids and eunuchs. Farther down the ladder were the noble ladies, first-class attendants, and second-class attendants, who had fewer privileges and often lived in shared quarters. Rank determined my everything. It dictated the quality of your silks, the size of your allowance, and the variety of food you ate. For example, while the Empress and top consorts received huge daily allotments of high-quality meats, a low-ranking attendant might receive only a fraction of that. Your rank was visible to all. It was reflected in the colours and patterns on your robes, the number of servants who followed you, and whether you could be carried in a palanquin. Bright yellow, for instance, was a colour reserved for the empress and emperor. Life was suffocatingly controlled. All women of the inner court were sequestered, forbidden from leaving the northern section of the palace. They were cut off from the outside world and unable to communicate with their families. Their every move was watched by the eunuchs, who were the only men, other than the emperor, allowed in the inner court. They were its guards, administrators, and spies. They were trusted because their castration meant they couldn't impregnate the women, ensuring any child born was the emperor's. This constant surveillance created an atmosphere of intense scrutiny, where any misstep could lead to severe punishment. It was a life lived under a microscope, daily life and the pursuit of favour. So what did a concubine actually do all day? For many, life was a monotonous and lonely cycle of waiting. When they weren't required to attend to the emperor, days could be incredibly boring. Mornings often began before dawn with elaborate beauty rituals that could last for hours. Women would apply complex makeup, sometimes using dangerous lead-based powders for a coveted pale complexion, and arrange their hair with heavy, ornate ornaments. Their time was then filled with activities deemed suitable for a lady of the court. They were expected to practice various arts to make themselves more appealing, such as painting, calligraphy, or playing musical instruments. Leisure activities included board games, embroidery, or walking in the palace gardens. Some consorts enjoyed playing on swings, a simple, almost heavenly pleasure. In winter, the emperor might even join his consorts for playful frolicking in the snow. But these pursuits were just ways to pass the hours. The single, all-consuming goal was to gain the emperor's favour. This was the only path to a higher rank, better living conditions, and security. The process of being chosen for the night was a bizarre and humiliating ritual. Each evening, eunuchs would present the emperor with a tray of tablets, each bearing a concubine's name. If the emperor was interested, he would flip one over. The chosen woman would then be bathed and inspected. Afterwards, she was stripped naked, wrapped tightly in a thick blanket, and physically carried by eunuchs to the emperor's chambers. This was to ensure she couldn't conceal any weapons. Eunuchs would then meticulously record the date and time to keep a precise track of any potential pregnancies. Many women, however, spent their entire lives in the palace without ever being chosen, living in a state of perpetual soul-crushing expectation. The battlefield of the harem. The Forbidden City's inner court was not a place of sisterly solidarity. It was a psychological battlefield, with hundreds and sometimes thousands of women all vying for the attention of one man. Jealousy and betrayal were rampant. A concubine's success almost guaranteed she'd become a target. Alliances were constantly forming and dissolving. Friendships were often a form of espionage, and love was a vulnerability that could be exploited. The weapons in this war were rarely physical. They were whispers, rumours, and carefully laid plots. A rival might accuse you of witchcraft, an illicit affair, or disrespecting a superior. These accusations, whether true or not, could be devastating. Consider the famous story of Consort Qi of the Han Dynasty. She was the beloved favourite of Emperor Gaozu, but after his death, the Empress Lu Ji took her revenge. The Empress had Consort Qi's son poisoned and then had the consort brutally mutilated. While ancient historical records can sometimes be exaggerated, the account says her limbs were cut off, her eyes gouged out, and she was left in a latrine, mockingly called the human swine. Poison was another favoured and terrifyingly common method of eliminating a rival. Some plants in the palace gardens were known to be toxic, and a few dropped leaves in a rival's tea could be a silent death sentence. The fear was constant. Women who gained the emperor's favour often had their food tasted by servants first, just in case a jealous enemy had tampered with it. The psychological toll was immense. Concubines had to master the art of hiding their true emotions, smiling when terrified and feigning devotion when they felt none. Survival often meant abandoning trust and compassion in favour of ruthless calculation. The double-edged sword of motherhood. In the high-stakes world of the harem, one act could change a woman's destiny more than any other, giving birth to a son. Since the primary goal was to ensure the continuation of the imperial bloodline, producing a male heir was the ultimate path to power and security. A woman who gave birth to a son, especially the firstborn, could see her status skyrocket overnight. She'd be elevated in rank, granted lavish gifts, and her family would be honored. She was no longer just a disposable plaything, but the mother of a potential future emperor. This made motherhood both the greatest opportunity and the greatest risk. As soon as a concubine became pregnant, she became a prime target. The history of the harem is filled with dark tales of miscarriages induced by accidents, mysterious illnesses, and poisonings. The competition didn't stop at birth. Infant mortality was tragically high, and many believed rival concubines were often responsible, using subtle methods to harm a newborn prince. However, if a son survived and was named the heir, his mother's power could become immense. When the old emperor died and her son ascended the throne, she would be elevated to the title of Empress Dowager. In this position, she could wield enormous political influence, often acting as regent and becoming the de facto ruler of the empire. The most famous example is Empress Dowager Cixi. She entered the court in the 1850s as a low-ranking concubine. Her fortunes changed dramatically when she gave birth to the emperor's only surviving son. Upon the emperor's death, her 5-year-old son became the new ruler, and Cixi, as Empress Dowager, became co-regent. Through masterful political maneuvering, she consolidated power and effectively ruled China from behind the scenes for nearly half a century, becoming one of the most powerful women in Chinese history. Her story is the ultimate testament to how motherhood could transform a concubine from a pawn into a queen. The inevitable decline. For the vast majority of concubines, a rise to power like Cixi's was an impossible dream. The much more common reality was a slow, inevitable decline. As a concubine aged, her beauty faded, and the emperor's attention moved on to younger women. Losing the emperor's favor meant a gradual slide into obscurity. Her privileges would be reduced, her servants reassigned, and her life would become even more isolated. The most dreaded fate for a disgraced concubine was to be sent to the cold palace. This wasn't one specific building, but a term for any remote, dilapidated quarters used to house women who had fallen from grace. Life there was effectively imprisonment, confinement with minimal food and no heating in the winter. It was a slow, miserable descent toward death. Despite giving birth to a future emperor, Consort Gong of the Ming dynasty was confined to such a place for decades because the Wanli emperor was embarrassed by her low status and favored another consort. The death of the emperor brought the ultimate uncertainty. In early dynasties, a horrifying practice known as xunzang required that some childless concubines be sacrificed and buried with the emperor to serve him in the afterlife. Though this practice of live burial was officially abolished and then later revived and re-abolished, other forms of forced suicide sometimes continued. More commonly, childless women were moved to secluded widows' quarters for the rest of their lives, essentially a form of house arrest. Others were sent to become Buddhist or Taoist nuns, an honorable but isolated existence. Some were even assigned the grim task of serving as eternal caretakers for the dead emperor's tomb, living out their days in lonely houses next to his mausoleum. Conclusion. Beyond the silks. The lives of imperial concubines were a study in extreme contrasts. They were surrounded by unparalleled luxury, the finest silks, priceless jewelry, and exquisite gardens. Yet they lived in a state of profound imprisonment. They were symbols of the emperor's immense power, yet they themselves were largely powerless, their existence defined by the whims of one man. Behind the romanticized facade of courtly life lay a dark reality of psychological warfare, constant surveillance, and crushing loneliness. For every woman who achieved a measure of influence, there were thousands whose names are lost to history, who lived and died in obscurity within the Forbidden City. Their lives weren't fairy tales. They were a testament to the human cost of absolute power, a story of personal sacrifice, erased identity, and the quiet endurance of women caught in a gilded cage. When we look beyond the silks and the palaces, we find the forgotten stories of real human beings whose lives were far more complex and tragic than any drama could ever capture. What are your thoughts on this system? Could you have survived life in the imperial harem? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more truths about history, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.